Hey there, and welcome to this first video of the series I'm going to produce on attachment theory. I am Sam Carr, and I'm a psychologist, a researcher, an author, and I've studied and taught and thought about and researched attachment theory for over 2 decades now. And in this first video, what I would like to do is simply set out one of the cornerstone assumptions of this theory. So if you really want to know when attachment theory sort of came into being, you're talking about, and many people will have heard of John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth, and their work back in the late 40s, the post-war years, early 50s, when attachment theory began to crystallize, really, and become something of an identified theory, a crystallized theory. And some of the basic assumptions that the theory is grounded upon are really important just to get right before you even move into anything about attachment styles and what even are attachment styles and can they change and all of the other stuff that comes out of the box when you start thinking about attachment theory. First and foremost, I would start from the very beginning. And that's what this video is all about. In its rawest form, I would say that attachment theory is largely a theory of vulnerability. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, if you think about it, we need safety and security most when we are vulnerable. And that might mean when we're afraid, when we are threatened, when we are sick or ill, and even sometimes when we encounter the unknown. The times in our journeys when we are most vulnerable are frequently the times where we need others the most. And the idea in the theory is that if you take the human infant, the baby, and you literally think about how threatening, frightening, alien it would be to go from the environment of the womb, where you've kind of been in symbiosis with your mother for the whole period of time that you've been inside her. You've been in this environment, and suddenly everything changes and you come into the world when you're born. And just think how threatening existentially that would be for a child, for an infant. You're moving from this womb environment where you've been in symbiosis. You haven't really had to think about feeding yourself, even breathing. You've been literally one with the mother. And then all of a sudden you're out in the world and the environment would be completely different and I mean that in terms of sensations. Literally, you're in a different sort of physical environment. The way it feels, the way it sounds, the way you experience it will be completely different. And the idea in attachment theory is that that's terrifying. It's a terrifying transition to make. And transitions often are terrifying in life, when you move from one phase of life to another. And here we're simply talking about sort of pre-birth to birth. There's this terrifying change. And the idea in attachment theory is that that's a particular state of vulnerability. You're going to be vulnerable there. Not least because you are completely helpless, and we are a species that can't move, as in literally move across the ground or through water. We can't move. We don't have locomotion when we're born. We learn that in the first couple of years of life. So we're really dependent also. We're afraid and we're dependent. And in that particular place, we need more than anything in this world. We're going to need a relationship or a caregiver. That might be one caregiver, or it might be more than one caregiver, but we're going to need a world that can care for us. And I would argue that in relation to that, infants kind of need three things. And I'd say what those three things are is, one, a caregiver who recognizes that you're distressed, you're afraid, you need looking after. And you might think, well, for most caregivers, that would be instinctive and that would be innate. You'd see that your child needs. And that's often true, but not always. You'd also not only need a caregiver who can recognize that you're distressed, but you'd need a caregiver who cares about the fact that you're distressed. So I see that you're distressed. Your distress kind of means something to me. It matters to me that you're distressed. And not only that, I also have the capacity to regulate and alleviate and respond empathically to your distress. And it's so important for the human infant to find that. A caregiver who offers those three things, it's so important to find that because survival literally depends on it. It literally depends on that. So the first thing to say is in attachment that vulnerability, which perhaps we experience very, very exaggeratedly at birth, vulnerability is the core of attachment. The theory is about, when I'm vulnerable, do I have faith that in the world around me, people can see my vulnerability and appreciate it? People care about my vulnerability, and people will respond empathically to that vulnerability. And infants rely on that for survival. As we get older, obviously, we don't rely on it for survival, but it still matters because in the life journey, we will feel vulnerable because of unfamiliarity, because of the turbulence of life, because of sickness, illness, disability, loss. We will feel vulnerable many, many times on our journey. We will be afraid. We will be threatened. When we are, what kind of caregiving environment do we have available to us? In its very simplest form, that's what attachment theory is a theory of. Now, if you take that really basic assumption, I'm going to move on now to an assumption that moves a little bit further than that. And this is something that the whole theory is predicated upon. Now, I remember one night I was reading in the university library, in the days where we actually did go into the library. But I was sitting in the library and I was reading an article by two of the leading researchers in attachment theory at the time. This was in the 90s, I think. And they were American researchers called Cindy Hazan and Philip Shaver. And they wrote a paper, and one nugget of gold popped out at me in that paper that night that I will always remember because it summarized attachment theory, certainly in young children and infants, very, very well. It summarized one of the basic assumptions. And what they said in that article, that one paragraph, was really important. I'll read it. They said, theoretically and logically speaking, there is no limit to the amount and kind of variability that can exist in models of the caregiving environment. Now, let's just take that one first. Theoretically and logically speaking, there's no limit to the amount and kind of variability that can exist in the caregiving environment. What they're saying is, if you think about how many times a child will feel distressed in the first few years of his or her life, it will be many. There'll be many, many times where a child feels afraid, threatened, and distressed. It could be because they are scared of the environment around them. Could be something's unfamiliar to them. Could be they are hungry and they feel distressed about the hunger. Whatever it could be. There are many, many, many times where an infant will feel distressed and will need regulation or someone to care for them. And how the infant expresses that distress and what the caregiver or caregivers, if it's more than one caregiver, will do in response to that distress is unlimited in how variable it is. That's what they're first saying. And if you went from house to house and you were a fly on the wall and you looked at what happens when the child in that house is genuinely distressed. I'm not talking here about distress on a sort of superficial level that I can't have the TV control tonight, or can I please eat that and not that. I'm talking about genuine distress. If you looked at how houses and caregivers and child dyads operate in that, you'd find that they're all different. They're snowflakes. Even if one house, the child needs something and is really needy and really anxious and expresses that need, and the caregiver gets angry, and in another house the same thing happens. The child expresses their distress and the caregiver gets angry. The way that anger is expressed and the way the child initially expresses the distress won't be exactly the same. What they're really saying is every house is a bit of a snowflake. It's a bit different. So in reality, how caregivers respond to infant distress and how infant distress is expressed is unlimited in its variability. If you looked at every possible model in the world, there'd be hundreds, millions, infinite numbers of how that might look. But what they go on to say, and I'll continue reading this quote, is that, however, in reality, what infants do in the first few years of their life is they pass the flow of information about the caregiver into a limited number of categories. What they're saying there is, what infants do over time is they begin to learn the caregiving environment. They learn that, okay, this is the place I find myself in, and when I'm in distress, I have learned to expect something. The caregiver has been predictable enough that I now think this is what the deal is in this home, this family, this space, this caregiving environment. And here's what the question in the paragraph I read says. Can I count on my attachment figure to be available and responsive when needed? Now, the infant doesn't literally walk around with a clipboard in the first few years of his or her life, literally with that question written on it, but somewhere in the recesses of the psyche, the child's brain, mind, whatever you want to call it, reaches a conclusion about the caregiver that they have got, or the caregivers that they have got. And they ask that question, can I count on my attachment figure, my caregiver, to be available and responsive when I need them? And there are only three answers they can come to. Yes, no, maybe. This is the critical part of this video. Yes, no, and maybe. When a child's saying no, it means I've got enough experience in this environment for me to develop some kind of rudimentary certainty that when I need, when I'm threatened, when I'm afraid, when I'm encountering the unfamiliar, I can't count on my caregiver. They've given me enough evidence that they're not a reliable source of comfort. They don't recognize my distress, or they don't care about it, or both. Or they can't respond to it appropriately, or all three. Somewhere in the infant's mind, somewhere in their psyche, they reach that certainty. The yes children, it's different. It's, yeah, I've got enough evidence, even if they're not always responsive, that more often than not, they are responsive, and I can count on them when I need them to be available. And they will give me a response that tends to help me alleviate and regulate my distress. And the maybe children, well, they're in a really different predicament because they do have an unpredictable caregiving environment. They're not sure if they can count on their caregiver. Sometimes the caregiver might be an impeccable model of responsiveness, empathy, recognition of distress. But other times they could be the complete opposite, and it's a kind of Jekyll and Hyde environment where you've no predictability. And the absolute cornerstone, or one of the absolute cornerstones in attachment theory, is this idea that in childhood, eventually, because of how caregivers respond to infant distress, over a period of time, children reach a certainty, or at least a basic answer to that fundamental question: can I count on these attachment figures or these caregivers to be there for me? And it's a yes and no or a maybe. And one of the cornerstones of the theory, and I will get to this in the next video, is that what happens is the yes children, the no children, and the maybe children develop very different ways of being in this world because of the fact that they can, can't, or aren't sure that they can count on their caregiver. And in the end, it's that yes, no, and maybe that will grow into a sort of garden. How should I be in this world? If I can't count on my attachment figure, is it worth expressing my distress? Should I just keep it to myself? Should I deal with it myself? Is it something to do with me? These things begin to grow like a garden. If it's a yes, it's yeah, I can count on them. So if I'm distressed, I can express it. If I'm in trouble or threatened or afraid, well, they're there for me. I know that. You set yourself up in the world differently depending on whether you're a yes, no, or maybe child, because you have to survive in that environment. And that's the essence of attachment theory's fundamental assumption of how caregiving gives rise to different ways of being that are really just adaptations to the environment you find yourself in. And in future videos, I'm going to talk in much more depth about what that means. But that's what the attachment styles we know and are most commonly spoken about today are kind of stemming from. The yes children tend to be more likely to develop what we'd call the secure attachment. The no children, well, they're more likely to be what we might call insecure children. And the maybe children, well, they're more likely to be what we might call disorganized in attachment. But again, I'll talk in much more depth in future videos about what that means and about the assumptions we're making in relation to that. But this is a fundamental. It's an assumption attachment theory makes. I'm not saying it's absolutely correct, but there's an awful lot of data to support that assumption. And it makes an awful lot of sense in a logical way. And in my own experience, I've seen an awful lot of evidence in my own research and research of others that tends to support the essence of that assumption. So there's your first video. In the next video, we'll elaborate more on that and continue it. So thanks for your attention on this one.